This is my true story. For decades, I worked with my hands, heart, and sweat to give my son a life I never had. I believed love and respect would be the reward for my years of sacrifice. But one night, everything changed. I asked for a little extra food, and instead of kindness, I felt pain. My own son slapped me. That moment broke something deep inside me. I chose not to shout, but to act. What I did next, you will not believe. Before that, tell me where you're watching from and the time there right now. And please subscribe so my story reaches more people. I was a man who spent decades in work, sweat, and sacrifice so my son could have something I never had. From the moment I first held him in my arms, I promised myself I would give him a life of comfort, a life without hunger or struggle. I worked long hours, sometimes from before sunrise until well past sunset, in factories, on fields, in markets, wherever work called me. My hands grew rough and scarred, my back bent with the weight of years, but I never complained. I thought every ache was part of my duty as a father. I skipped meals many nights so my son could eat more, ensuring his plate was full while mine stayed empty. I remember those nights vividly, when I sat quietly in the kitchen, feeling the hunger deep inside me, yet watching my son eat with satisfaction. It gave me joy, a quiet satisfaction, knowing he would not know what hunger felt like. But with time, those sacrifices became invisible to him. They became taken for granted. I never asked for praise or reward. I only wanted respect. Simple respect for the life I gave. I thought asking for respect was natural between a father and his child. But I never imagined that the boy I raised would repay kindness with cruelty. From the beginning, I wanted to be more than a provider. I wanted to be a guide, a safe place where he could turn when the world was harsh. I taught him how to stand tall, how to work hard, and how to live with dignity. I taught him that nothing worth having comes without effort, and that the love between a father and his child was sacred. For years, I believed that my son carried those lessons in his heart. I believed my example was enough. As he grew, I watched with pride when he first learned to ride his bicycle, when he graduated school, and when he took his first job. Each milestone was a victory for me. I thought my sacrifices had built a man who would value hard work and respect the hands that fed him. I believed the bond we shared was unshakable, founded on years of care, protection, and love. Yet, as time passed, something began to change. I noticed a shift in his eyes, a coldness creeping into his voice. I saw impatience when I spoke, a dismissive glance when I offered advice. I ignored it at first, telling myself it was the arrogance of youth, that he would grow out of it. But the signs grew clearer with every passing day. My sacrifices became invisible, my presence a burden to him. I still provided without complaint, still offered help when I could. But I began to feel a quiet weight in my chest, the weight of unacknowledged sacrifice, the loneliness of being invisible in my own home. I did not confront him. I did not demand respect. I continued to give, hoping he would remember the lessons I taught him. But deep down, I feared the truth. Respect could not be taken for granted, and kindness alone was not enough to protect dignity. Years of giving had taught me patience. But patience has its limits. I had built my life around providing for him, and when he repaid me with cruelty, that patience cracked. My heart carried the wounds of every meal skipped, every hardship endured without complaint. Every night I went to bed with empty hands, but a full heart. That sacrifice was the essence of my life, and yet, in one moment, it was met with something I could never forget. That moment came quietly at first, but it burned like fire. It was not just a slap. It was an act that carried the weight of years of neglect and disrespect. It was a breaking point. In that moment, I realized that sacrifice without respect was not enough. That dignity, once stripped away, could not be rebuilt with silence. That night, I sat alone, my mind heavy with decades of sacrifice, wondering how to answer cruelty with something greater. I thought deeply about my life and my choices. I thought about every hour I worked, every pain I endured, every hope I had for him. I thought about the hunger I endured silently so that he could eat. I thought about the meaning of love and respect, and whether they could survive without gratitude. In my heart, I made a decision. I would not answer his cruelty with bitterness or loud confrontation. I would act quietly, with purpose, in a way that spoke louder than words ever could. I would show him that every action has a consequence, that disrespect carries a price, and that dignity is something worth defending at all costs. That decision became my plan. I would answer a lifetime of sacrifice, met with humiliation, not with tears, but with action. A silent action that would speak across years, louder than any shouting or pleading could. A decision that would remind him that a father's sacrifice is not a weakness to be mocked, but a strength to be honored. I began preparing quietly, without telling anyone. I knew this path would not be easy. I knew that it would require careful thought, patience, and resolve. But in my heart, I knew it was the only way to reclaim what had been taken from me, not in wealth or property, but in the restoration of my dignity and the teaching of a lasting lesson. For a lifetime, I had given without asking for return. Now, I would take something back. Not out of greed, but out of the need to answer cruelty with truth. My sacrifice was not done in vain. My dignity was not forfeit. And in that quiet resolve, I found the strength to act. The change in my son did not happen overnight. It came slowly, like the shifting of shadows at dusk, almost unnoticed at first. I remember thinking that perhaps I was imagining things. Perhaps my own mind was playing tricks, making small matters seem larger because my heart was tender to the idea of being forgotten. But the signs became clearer over time, and they began to sting deeper with each passing day. At first, it was small things, a slight hesitation before answering when I spoke, a glance that quickly shifted away when I entered a room, a faint sigh when I asked him to listen. I told myself it was fatigue, stress, or perhaps a reflection of the world he lived in, but I could not ignore the quiet shift in his behavior. I had always believed that respect was a two-way street. I believed that if I gave my son love, care, and shelter, he would return it with honor and understanding. I thought he would grow into a man who valued the lessons I taught him. Yet I began to notice that my words were met with impatience. When I spoke of old values, of working hard and giving without complaint, he would nod with a faint smile that carried no warmth. It was a smile that said, "This is old and unnecessary." The voice I once heard with reverence now spoke with a tone of dismissal. I could see it in his eyes, a quiet superiority that I had not known before. It was not just the tone of voice. It was the way he moved through the house, as if my presence was an inconvenience. I was no longer consulted in decisions, no longer asked for my opinion. The dinners we once shared became hurried affairs, with my requests brushed aside and my concerns treated as trivial. I remember the first time I felt truly unwelcome, when I asked him if we could eat together as a family, and he said without hesitation that he was too busy. He did not even glance up from his phone. That moment sank into my heart. I knew something had changed irreversibly. His wife, too, seemed to encourage this shift. I noticed the way she looked at me, as if I were an unnecessary part of their lives. Her laughter sometimes carried an edge, a quiet mockery that I could not ignore. I overheard her whispering to my son that I was old-fashioned, that my ways were outdated, that I was a burden to their lives. It was not spoken to my face, but it was said in a way that made the words cut deeper. Words spoken in whispers are often the most cruel, for they spread without defense and lodge in the mind, like seeds that grow unseen but poisonous. I endured quietly at first, telling myself patience was a father's strength. I thought if I continued to show love without complaint, if I continued to offer help without asking for return, respect would eventually return. I believed that the bond between father and son was stronger than any moment of misunderstanding or cruelty. But silence, I learned, can also be a wound. Silence can teach disrespect to grow quietly, feeding on the absence of opposition. My patience began to erode, replaced by a quiet awareness that the respect I once took for granted was slipping away. The signs of disrespect became more obvious. My words were no longer met with the warmth of understanding. Requests for help or simple kindness were met with reluctance. Even small acts of communication, a nod of acknowledgement, a smile, a gentle word, became rare. I was becoming a stranger in my own home. The man who had built that home, brick by brick, who had given his life to secure it for his son, was being treated as an outsider. That realization burned quietly inside me, deeper than any slap could. There was a moment I remember vividly, a small but telling incident. I had asked him if I could borrow his tools for a repair I needed to make. He gave me a look of impatience, as though my request was an inconvenience. "Can't you buy your own?" he said, his voice sharp. It was not the words themselves, but the tone that carried the sting. The words echoed in my mind long after, growing louder in the silence of my thoughts. It was the realization that respect was no longer a given in this house. Respect is not something that can be demanded. It must be earned, nurtured, and protected. I began to reflect on the life I had lived and the love I had given. I thought of every sacrifice, every sleepless night, every hardship endured so that my son could stand in comfort. I thought of the years I spent ensuring he never knew hunger, never knew fear, never knew doubt about his place in the world. And now, those years seemed to vanish in the quiet cruelty of impatience and disregard. I could not ignore the signs any longer. They were not fleeting moments. They were repeated, consistent, deliberate. The coldness in his voice was now matched by his actions. I saw how he spoke to me in public, with a lack of patience, almost with embarrassment. I saw how he ignored me when others were around, how he dismissed my advice without thought. The home I once thought was built on mutual love and respect was now a place where I was treated as an outsider. The first time I felt humiliation settle in my bones was when he laughed openly at my expense in front of friends. It was not a cruel laugh meant to wound deeply, at least not in that moment, but it carried with it a disregard that wounded far more than words. I remember looking down at my hands, scarred and worn, and realizing that those hands had built everything around him. Yet those hands were now treated with indifference, and that indifference was a wound I could not heal with silence alone. My son's disrespect became a quiet storm that gathered force. It was in his words, his tone, his body language, and the small gestures of disregard that added up over time. It was in the way he treated me when we were alone, and even more so in the way he treated me when others were present. There was no conversation, no explanation, just the slow erosion of respect. And as the signs grew, so did a growing quietness in me. I was no longer speaking as much. I was no longer asking questions. I began to watch, to record silently in my heart the moments that spoke louder than words. I realized that disrespect is not a single act. It is a pattern, a tide that rises slowly and overtakes a shore before it is noticed. And once it has taken hold, it changes everything. I felt that change deep inside myself, as if my role as a father was slipping away, replaced by a shadow I could not recognize. The home that had been built on sacrifice was now clouded by contempt. That realization was the heaviest weight of all. I did not speak about it. I carried it quietly, like a wound that festers under the skin. I told myself patience was my answer, that time could restore what was lost. But deep down, I knew something had to change. Respect was not returning. It was disappearing, slipping further away with every careless word and every dismissive glance. And with that awareness came a deep sadness, the realization that the cruelty I was enduring was not a momentary lapse, but a reflection of something deeper, something I could not ignore any longer. The signs of disrespect were clear to me then, and they could not be undone. They marked the beginning of a turning point in my life. They were the signal that my patience had been tested beyond its limits, and that my silence could no longer be my answer. I knew that the moment of choice was coming, and that choice would not be about words, but about action. And so, in that quiet realization, I began to plan. I began to think about what it meant to be a father, what it meant to protect dignity, and what it meant to answer cruelty with purpose. I knew that when the time came, I would no longer be silent, that the signs of disrespect would not be the end of my story, but the beginning of a quiet justice that would speak louder than any apology. One evening, the air in our home was heavy with silence. The daylight had faded, and the kitchen light glowed dim, casting long shadows across the old wooden table where we sat together. It had been a long day for me, as it always was. My back ached, my legs felt weak, and my hands still carried the stiffness of years of labor. I had spent decades working for my family, providing for them through storms of hardship, hunger, and sleepless nights. That day had been no different. I had gone without proper food myself, pushing my own needs aside so that others might eat well. Dinner was simple: rice, a little curry, and some bread, but it was enough for everyone at the table. As the meal went on, I noticed my plate was almost empty, and my stomach still felt the gnaw of hunger. I thought quietly of asking for just a little more, a small portion to take away the emptiness. I had never been one to demand, and I knew my place in the family. But this time, my body felt tired, my spirit worn, and my heart heavy with years of giving without acknowledgement. I quietly set my fork down and with a soft voice asked him, my own son, if I might have just a little more food. It was a simple request, one I thought would be granted without hesitation, for it was not out of greed, but of need. Instead of an answer, his eyes hardened. He looked at me in a way I had never seen before, not as a father, not as a man who had given him life and sustenance, but as an inconvenience. A shadow of contempt flickered across his face. His lips curled into a smile that was not kind. The air felt colder in that moment. I opened my mouth to explain, to remind him of the years of sacrifice, but the words caught in my throat. Before I could speak, his hand rose sharply, and I felt the sudden force of his palm crash against my cheek. The sound of the slap was loud, sharp enough to cut through the quiet of the kitchen, sharp enough to echo in my bones. It was not just a physical blow. It was a blow to my dignity, to my pride, to the years I had poured into him without question. The taste of bitterness filled my mouth as I sat frozen. My cheek burned, not just from the sting of his hand, but from the humiliation. I could feel my heart tighten, as if the years of love and labor were being stripped away with that one cruel act. The slap was not done in private. It was done in front of everyone. My daughter-in-law, seated beside him, looked on with a smirk. Others in the room had gone silent, the air thick with awkwardness and shock. Outside, the neighbors could hear the sound, though none dared intervene. Laughter followed the slap, cruel laughter that seemed to echo louder than the blow itself. It was the sound of mockery, of derision, of disrespect made public. That moment stayed with me long after the meal ended. I sat there, silent, staring at my plate. My hands trembled slightly, though not from hunger. I felt something far deeper, a wound inside me that no healing could touch. The humiliation was unbearable. For years, I had endured hardships without complaint, believing that love, respect, and family honor would be enough. I had believed that my sacrifices would be recognized one day. But now, in the middle of my own home, the very place I had built with my own hands and my own sweat, my own son had declared me useless with the slap of his hand. I could not stop the memories from flooding in. I remembered the nights I had worked late, laboring in the fields and the workshops, skipping meals so that my son could have enough. I remembered the mornings when I rose before the sun, my back aching, to prepare food for him before he left for school. I remembered the years of denying myself comforts so that he could have shoes on his feet and books in his hands. And here he was, repaying decades of love with humiliation and cruelty in front of others. That slap was not simply the physical pain, it was the breaking of something deeper: trust, respect, and the bond between father and son. As the evening wore on, the room seemed to close in around me. The laughter and whispers outside the kitchen became a blur. My thoughts became louder than the voices, replaying the moment again and again, each replay a fresh sting. I saw the expression on his face, cold and unyielding. I heard the laughter, sharp and cruel, as if it were carved into my memory. My hand touched my cheek, feeling the warmth of the blow and the dull ache beneath the skin. But it was not the pain that hurt most. It was the understanding that respect had been replaced by scorn, love replaced by contempt, and a lifetime of sacrifice replaced by a single, humiliating act. I sat there long after the others had left the table, long after the laughter had faded into silence. I did not speak. I did not move. I simply sat, my mind heavy with reflection. The slap had spoken for him. It had declared his judgment, that I was no longer worthy of respect, no longer worthy of a place at his table. I realized then that no amount of pleading or reasoning could restore what had been lost. The wound was not something words could heal. It was a wound that required action, a silent but powerful answer that would speak louder than anything I could say. That night, as I lay in bed with my cheeks still sore and my heart still heavy, I thought of my life. I thought of every sacrifice I had made, every hardship I had endured, every kindness I had given without expectation. I thought of the years of labor, of working in silence so that my family could have life, and I thought of the slap, not as a moment of weakness, but as a turning point. I realized that this was not just an insult, it was a challenge. It was a challenge to my dignity, to my pride, to the years of my life. And I knew then that I would not remain silent any longer. That slap became a turning point for me. It became the moment when patience turned into resolve, when endurance turned into action. I knew that the next step I would take must be quiet, legal, and irreversible. It must be a response that would strip away the arrogance that had been shown to me and leave nothing but truth in its place. I did not need confrontation. I needed justice. And so, as I lay in the dim light of my room that night, I began to plan, quietly, with care, and with the certainty that the action I would take would speak louder than any words. The next morning arrived with quiet purpose. I woke before dawn, not because I could not sleep, but because sleep felt unnecessary now. My decision had settled in my mind like a stone placed firmly at the center of my life. There was no turning back. The air in the house was still, as if even the walls had learned to keep the secret I now carried. I dressed slowly, deliberately, as though each movement was part of a ritual preparing me for what lay ahead. I walked to my study, where the desk still carried the marks of years of careful planning. The worn edges of wood polished by years of leaning elbows, the faint scratches of pens and papers past. I opened the drawer where I kept my records, the small notebook containing every detail I needed. There were bank statements, ownership papers, and quietly kept agreements. These were the tools I would need. I touched each document briefly, as if acknowledging them for the last time before they would serve their purpose. Everything I had endured was now fuel for this quiet plan. The years of labor, the sleepless nights, the sacrifices made without recognition, they were all leading to this moment. I remembered the slap as clearly as if it had happened yesterday. The sound, the sting, the laughter that followed. It was not just the pain of the hand that struck me, but the humiliation of being reduced to something unseen, unworthy. That moment had become my turning point, and now, with clarity, I knew the answer would not be spoken, but done. I began my preparations with care. There was no need for haste, only precision. I made a list of every step I would take, writing it quietly in the notebook. The first step was to contact the bank. But I would not speak of this to anyone, not to friends, not to neighbors, not to family. This was mine alone to bear and to act upon. I knew that silence was my greatest ally. Words could betray intention, could give warning. Action, however, would speak in certainty. By mid-morning, I dressed in the quiet dignity of a man about to claim what was his. I took my papers and walked to the bank. The streets were calm, the morning light soft on the walls of the city. I moved without urgency, blending into the day as though I were just another face among many. But inside me, my purpose was sharpened. I was not going to speak loudly. I was not going to shout. I would simply do what I had decided. At the bank, I requested a private meeting. I did not need explanations, only action. There were formalities to follow, documents to sign, identifications to present. I moved through them quietly, without haste, with an air of certainty that came from knowing I had the right to act. I spoke to no one about my reasons. They were mine alone. The bank officers dealt with me professionally, unaware of the storm that lay beneath my calm exterior. The transfer took time. I watched as the paperwork moved through the system, as the numbers on the screen shifted quietly from one account to another. Every step felt deliberate, each movement a part of the larger act of reclaiming dignity. There was no haste, no shouting, no drama, only the quiet certainty of a man acting with purpose. When the final form was signed, there was a weight lifted. The transaction was complete. Every penny, every cent was moved. There was no turning back. I left the bank without announcement, without confrontation. The streets were quiet as I walked away, each step carrying the resolve of a decision made. I felt no joy in what I had done, no satisfaction in revenge. What I felt was peace, a deep and quiet peace that comes from knowing that you have answered cruelty with certainty. I did not speak to anyone that day. My plan was still hidden, waiting for the moment of revelation. Back at the house, I did not announce my action. I moved quietly, as though nothing had happened. I made no preparations for confrontation. I did not look at my son, nor did I speak of the transaction. Everything was kept in silence. The act itself would speak louder than any words I could offer. This was not about spectacle. It was about certainty. When the time came, I would reveal what I had done, and it would be final. The hours passed slowly, each one adding weight to the silence I carried. I thought of how the truth would land. I imagined my son's face when he realized what had been done. I imagined the shock, the disbelief. But I did not imagine anger, for I knew there was no satisfaction in prolonging cruelty. I would answer only once, quietly, firmly, and without drama. I wanted my action to be complete in itself, without the need for further explanation. That afternoon, I prepared myself for what was to come. I gathered the necessary papers, the proof of the transaction, and placed them in an envelope. This was the proof of my answer, the evidence of my decision. I held it quietly in my hand, feeling its weight. It was not just paper, it was the symbol of dignity restored, of a life reclaimed. I knew then that this was more than action, it was closure. By evening, I was ready. I did not rush. I did not speak. The house was quiet, as though waiting for the moment of revelation. I knew that when I handed over the envelope, everything would change. This was the moment when silence would break, when my quiet action would become a statement. I held the envelope with both hands, feeling the certainty of my choice. I was ready to answer not with noise, but with truth. And so I acted. I called my son quietly, asking him to meet me. There was no hint of anger in my voice, no threat, no warning. I wanted him to see the truth as it was, without drama. When he arrived, I did not speak much. I handed him the envelope. Inside were the papers proving that his account had been emptied. There was no need for explanation. The truth was there in black and white. My eyes met his, and in that moment, silence became the most powerful reply. He looked at me, disbelief written across his face. I said nothing. There was nothing left to say. I turned and walked away. I left the house quietly, without looking back. The action was complete. The decision had been made, and I had carried it through. There was no more room for cruelty, no more need for argument. I had answered with certainty, and in that silence, I found peace. That night, I sat alone in my room, feeling the weight of what I had done. There was no joy, no malice, only quiet satisfaction. I had taken my dignity back. I had answered cruelty without surrendering to it. I had acted not in haste, but with purpose. And in that moment, I knew that my path was clear. The future would not hold bitterness, only the quiet certainty that I had reclaimed what was mine. When the time came for the revelation, I knew it would change everything. I had planned it not as an outburst, not as a confrontation, but as a quiet statement of truth. For days I had lived with silence, carrying the weight of my decision in my heart. That silence had been my shield, my strategy, and my answer until now. The moment to break it was not born of anger, but of necessity. I needed him to know without doubt what had happened and why. The morning was calm. The sun rose slowly, casting long light across the streets. Inside the house, everything felt still, as though the walls themselves held their breath. I did not rush my preparations. I moved quietly, as I always had. I dressed simply, in the clothes of a man at peace with what he was about to do. Every movement was deliberate. There was no drama here, only the certainty of action. I took the envelope I had prepared earlier and placed it carefully in my coat pocket. I did not open it again. There was no need. I knew what it contained, and the truth within those papers was enough to speak louder than any words I could offer. I moved to the living room where my son would meet me. I waited quietly, sitting in my chair, my hands resting on my knees. My heart was steady. My mind was clear. When my son arrived, he did not expect what I had planned. His face held the same arrogance it had carried the night of the slap, as though nothing I could do would matter. But I did not react to his expression. I did not speak in anger or accusation. I simply motioned for him to sit, and when he did, I placed the envelope before him. The weight of it seemed heavier than the paper itself. He looked at me, confused at first, then suspicious. "What is this?" he asked, his voice sharp but uncertain. I said nothing. I had no need to explain in that moment. The silence was enough. I watched as he slowly pulled the papers from the envelope, unfolding them with careful fingers. His eyes grew wider with each page, his lips tightening. There was no sound except the soft rustle of paper, but it felt louder than a shout in that room. When he finished reading, he looked up at me, disbelief etched into every line of his face. This can't be real," he said quietly, as if saying it might undo what he had just read. But I did not speak. I let him sit with it, let the weight of the truth sink in without my interference. The silence between us was not empty. It was filled with everything that had led to this moment, years of sacrifice, humiliation, and the quiet resolve to act. He opened his mouth to speak again, but no words came. I saw the change in him, the shift from arrogance to shock, from confidence to silence. It was a transformation I had waited for, but I did not gloat. I did not revel in his discomfort. My purpose was not revenge in its cruelest form, but a restoration of my own dignity. And now, in that quiet living room, that purpose had been fulfilled. I rose slowly from my chair. I did not look at him again. I walked to the door without a word, leaving the envelope on the table where he could not ignore it. I opened the door and stepped outside. The air was fresh and cool, carrying with it the scent of morning and change. I did not look back. Behind me, I knew, was the sound of silence heavier than any argument, heavier than any slap, heavier than any apology that would never come. The moment was complete. The truth had been revealed, and with it, a final chapter closed. I walked away with steady steps, carrying nothing but the certainty of my action. I did not need to watch his reaction. The act itself was enough. My silence was my answer, my final word. And as I stepped into the world beyond that door, I felt something I had not felt in years: peace. For days afterwards, I heard whispers. Neighbors spoke quietly of what had happened. Friends and distant relatives murmured about the quiet but absolute nature of my act. There were no loud arguments, no public scenes, only the slow and certain understanding that what I had done was final. My son did not speak to me again. He did not ask for explanation, and I did not offer one. Silence was the language we had both come to know. In that silence, I carried my peace. The act was not born of hatred, but of clarity. I had answered cruelty with certainty. I had taken away what had been given without respect. I had done so quietly, without spectacle, so that the truth could stand on its own. And in that quiet, I had reclaimed what was mine: my dignity, my peace, my answer. That evening, as the sun set, I sat alone in my room. The day's events replayed in my mind, not as a story of vengeance, but as a story of resolution. I thought of the years that had led me here, the sacrifices made, the slaps endured, the words left unsaid. and I thought of the power of quiet action. The choice to answer not with noise, but with certainty. That choice had been mine, and I had taken it fully, without hesitation. The envelope remained on the table in that house, a silent witness to the act. It was proof of the decision I had made, the justice I had carried out without fanfare. For me, it was enough. There was no need for arguments, no need for confrontation. The truth had been spoken through action, and that truth was final. I had emptied the account not out of malice, but as a final answer to years of being unseen, unheard, and disrespected. I knew then that what I had done would follow me for the rest of my life, not as a burden, but as a quiet testament to what dignity meant. It was not about money, nor about proving a point. It was about taking a stand in the simplest and most certain way I knew how. And so I left the house, leaving behind the envelope, the silence, and the certainty of my choice. That night, I lay in my bed far from the house I had left behind. The world was still, and I felt a peace I had not known in years. The revelation was complete. My act was done. And in the quiet that followed, I knew I had answered not just my son's cruelty, but a deeper truth about who I was. The fallout began quietly, almost imperceptibly, but its effects were deep and lasting. My son did not call me again. There was no attempt to reach out, no message of apology, no explanation for what had happened. Silence replaced the noise that once filled our home. In that silence, I could hear everything: the weight of years, the sting of humiliation, and the truth of what I had done. It was not an act that demanded noise. It was an act that demanded understanding, and that understanding came slowly. In the days that followed, the atmosphere around him changed. Those who had once admired his confidence and authority now looked at him differently. Colleagues began to whisper when he entered a room, their voices low and uncertain. Friends who once greeted him warmly now offered quiet nods, as if unsure whether to speak at all. The respect he had commanded began to crumble, not through confrontation, but through the quiet ripple of consequence. The world around him began to shift, and I knew it was because of my actions. Neighbors, too, learned of the change. The laughter that had followed my slap at the dinner table was replaced by whispers in the corridors. People spoke quietly about what had happened, about the man who had taken everything without raising his voice. They spoke of the quiet justice, of the dignity reclaimed in silence. They spoke of the father who had endured insult without answer, and who had chosen a path far removed from vengeance. My act became their story, and in their telling, it grew larger than my own understanding of it. At first, he tried to maintain control. He acted as if nothing had happened, as if the world could ignore what had been done. But control is fragile, and pride is easily broken. As days passed, the truth settled in. His business faced challenges he had never expected. Creditors began to call, partnerships shifted. Friends who had once supported him began to withdraw. There was a quiet collapse, a slow crumbling of the foundation he had built. And in that collapse, there was the truth of my action. It was not a single blow, but a force that moved steadily, unseen but undeniable. He came to realize, too late, the cost of his cruelty. He understood that the slap had not been the end, but the beginning of a reckoning. It was not something that could be undone with words, nor with anger. The weight of his loss pressed upon him like the tide, and there was no stopping it. He could search for answers, he could plead or argue, but the truth had been laid bare in silence. That truth was the quiet power of what had been taken, and the impossibility of retrieving it without confronting the years of disrespect that had led to it. Relatives began to speak in hushed tones. They watched from the distance of family gatherings, noting the change in him. The arrogance that had once defined him now seemed diminished. His voice carried less certainty, his steps less confidence. The story of what I had done spread quietly, not in loud declarations, but in knowing glances and soft murmurs. It became part of our shared history, a lesson in dignity and the cost of cruelty. And in those hushed conversations, I found my answer fulfilled, not in confrontation, but in quiet transformation. In the end, I did not gloat. I did not return to confront him again. There was no need. The silence between us was louder than any argument, and the weight of what had been done was enough. I had given him the last answer I intended to give, and it was wrapped in quietness and certainty. I watched from afar, knowing that his life had changed in ways he could not undo, and that was enough. My role was complete. I carried no joy in his downfall. My action was not born of malice, but of a need to reclaim what had been taken from me, my dignity, my voice, my right to stand without insult. And so I let the world turn without adding noise. I did not call friends to announce my victory. I did not confront him in public. I allowed the silence to speak for itself, knowing that the truth of what I had done would outlast any words. In the quiet that followed, I felt the weight of years lift from my shoulders. I had endured humiliation, spoken softly to the world, and acted without spectacle. And now, as the days turned to weeks, I felt a strange peace. The act was complete, and the fallout was no longer my burden to carry. It was his, and the world's. Neighbors, friends, and even strangers spoke of what had happened with a mixture of astonishment and respect. They told the story quietly, without bitterness, as a reminder that dignity cannot be stolen without cost. That cost was now clear. My son had learned it without me saying a single word beyond what I had done. My silence had been my answer, and the truth of it had echoed louder than any argument could. That is the nature of fallout. It is quiet, but it is lasting. It is not in the noise of confrontation, but in the weight of consequence. And in the stillness that followed, I found my own closure. I did not need his apology, nor his understanding. I needed only to know that I had acted in a way that preserved my dignity and spoke the truth without shouting it. That was enough for me. As days passed, I watched from a distance as his life shifted. The people who once walked beside him began to step away. The friends who had once supported him now offered silence. His pride was diminished, and in that diminishing, I saw the quiet power of what had been done. It was not revenge in the way the world thinks of it. It was restoration, a reclaiming of what had been lost, and the closing of a chapter without a loud farewell. And so I let him live with the fallout. I did not return. I did not offer explanation. I let him bear the weight of what he had created with his words and actions. And I walked away with mine. The escape was quiet. There were no dramatic farewells, no loud declarations, no angry confrontations. I knew that the act I had taken, the silent answer to the slap, was enough. My dignity was restored, and my presence in that home was no longer necessary. I understood then that the greatest escape is not the one made in noise and fury, but the one made in silence and resolve. So I began to plan my departure, not as a rush, but as a careful, quiet movement towards something I could call peace. I sold whatever possessions I could without attracting attention. I emptied drawers slowly, taking only what was necessary and leaving the rest to the house that would no longer be mine. I did not speak of it to anyone. The lawyer I consulted understood my intention and worked quietly to arrange everything without alerting my son. I was determined that my leaving would be without spectacle, for spectacle is often the breeding ground of regret. I wanted my escape to be final, complete, and without noise. The day I left was a day like any other. I rose early, as I had for decades, and prepared myself quietly. My suitcase was packed with essentials, clothing, a few personal items, a small bundle of memories. I did not leave a note. I left no message of farewell. I understood that my departure was not for argument or explanation. It was a closure I owed to myself. In that silence, I found strength. The silence was my final answer, my last act of dignity. I booked my ticket in secrecy through a small travel agency that did not know my history. I chose a place far from where my life had been, a place where I could disappear into quiet streets and the rhythm of a life untouched by betrayal. The choice was deliberate. I wanted no reminders of what had happened, no familiar faces to ask questions I had no intention of answering. My escape was not just from a home or a family. It was from a chapter that had ended in cruelty and silence. When I left, I stepped away without looking back. The road to the airport was calm, and the city seemed unaware of my departure. There were no last words exchanged with neighbors, no dramatic gestures. I slipped quietly into the world beyond. Every step I took was a step toward peace. Every breath was a breath away from the humiliation, the insult, and the betrayal I had endured. That journey was more than a physical one. It was a movement of my spirit toward freedom. Once I arrived in the new place, I chose a small coastal town. The air was salty, the streets slow, and the people quiet. I rented a modest home by the sea, a place where I could live without the weight of the past pressing down on me. There were no echoes of my son's voice, no reminders of the slap, no neighbors to whisper. Here, I could be simply myself, a man who had endured, who had answered without shouting, and who had found a way to leave without losing his dignity. In those first weeks, I walked along the shore every morning. I watched the tide and listened to the wind, and with each wave I felt a little more of the old weight lift from my shoulders. I did not seek revenge anymore. Revenge had been quiet, deliberate, and complete. What remained was peace, a peace I had chosen over anger. The sound of the sea became my daily prayer, a reminder that life continues beyond the cruelty we endure. I found work quietly, taking small jobs that allowed me to live simply. I did not wish to amass wealth, only to live with dignity and quiet independence. My life became measured by small joys, morning walks, the taste of fresh bread, a conversation with a kind stranger. I discovered the value of living without expectation, of building a life that was mine and mine alone. The escape had given me not just freedom, but a new sense of self. As days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, I realized I had left behind more than just a home. I had left behind a cycle of disrespect, anger, and silence that could never have been broken if I had stayed. My escape was not an act of running away. It was an act of reclaiming what was lost. I had chosen dignity over destruction, peace over continued pain. In that choice, I found the answer I had sought all along. I never looked back. There were no letters, no calls, no attempts to reconnect. That chapter was closed. My escape was complete, and in that completeness, I found something I had not expected: healing. I learned that leaving is not always an act of defeat. Sometimes it is the most powerful answer to cruelty. My journey had taken me far from the place of my pain, and in that distance, I found a new home, a new peace, and a new beginning. Now, as an old man, I tell this story calmly, without anger, without boast. I tell it because I have learned something worth sharing, that respect is earned, dignity is preserved, and sometimes the only answer to cruelty is quiet action. I have lived long enough to know that pain fades, but lessons remain. I tell this story not to boast of what I did, but to explain why I did it. I tell it so that others may understand that silence is not weakness and departure is not defeat. It is a choice for peace. When I look back now, I see the years not in moments of insult, but in the quiet sacrifices I made without asking for thanks. I see the nights I went without so that my son could eat, the days I worked in silence so my family could live with comfort. I see the years when I believed that my love, my care, my life would be enough to protect me from cruelty. And I see now that sometimes love is not enough. Sometimes dignity must be defended in ways the heart alone cannot bear. I have learned that cruelty is not always loud. It can be quiet, a look, a word, a slap. These can wound deeper than any sword. My son's words, his actions, were not just a moment of anger. They were years of quiet disrespect that I endured. And I endured them because I believed in family, because I believed in patience, because I believed that time would heal. But time did not heal. It hardened. It hardened the cruelty, and it hardened me to the truth that silence can no longer be the only answer. In that moment, when he slapped me for asking for something as simple as extra food, I realized that I had lost more than my pride. I had lost the respect I had once taken for granted, and I knew that my answer could not be words. Words are fleeting. Actions are lasting. So I acted, quietly, deliberately, without spectacle. I emptied his bank account, not out of malice, but as a statement, not to destroy, but to reclaim, not to humiliate, but to answer a wound in the only way I could. Leaving the country was the final answer. It was the closing of a chapter, the final act in a story that had been written in years of sacrifice and moments of betrayal. I left quietly because I wanted no more noise. I wanted no more confrontation. I wanted peace. And peace I found far from the house, far from the insults, far from the people who had once been my family. My escape was not just from a place, it was from a way of being that no longer served me. I escaped into a life of my own making. Now, living in that quiet town by the sea, I understand what my escape truly was. It was not a retreat. It was not surrender. It was an assertion of self-worth. It was a declaration that I would not allow disrespect to define the end of my life. I chose to leave so that I could live. I chose to walk away so that I could preserve the dignity I had been denied. I chose silence over argument, departure over degradation. And in that choice, I found something more valuable than revenge: peace. The story I tell now is not one of anger. It is one of reflection. I do not speak with bitterness, because bitterness is a weight I have learned to lay down. I speak with quiet certainty, knowing that the choices I made were mine alone. I speak with the calm of a man who has lived enough to understand that life's greatest victories are not won in noise and confrontation, but in quiet decisions that protect the soul. My victory was not in taking his money. It was in taking back my life. I learned that dignity cannot be stolen. It must be protected. I learned that respect is not given by words alone. It is built in the choices we make, even in the face of cruelty. I learned that silence can be the loudest answer, and departure can be the strongest reply. And I learned that peace is found not in winning against others, but in winning back yourself. That was my lesson. That was my truth. My final thought is simple. He slapped me for asking for extra food. That slap was not just a blow to my face, it was a blow to my life. And I answered not with shouting, not with rage, but with silence, action, and departure. I emptied his account. I left the country. I never came back. I did not return because I had already returned, to myself. And that, in the end, was the greatest revenge, the truest answer, and the deepest peace I could have ever found.